Hey, I'm Dan. I'm a real estate agent and a carpenter and a licensed home improvement contractor in New Jersey. So, if you are thinking of selling your house or looking to buy a house, we know how important the kitchen is. And the centerpiece of a kitchen, obviously, is the cabinetry. So, I want to talk about something that is fairly common that I think causes people a lot of undue stress, and that is paint damage on kitchen cabinet doors, drawer faces, maybe on the faces of the cabinet themselves or on the cabinet boxes. Is this something that's like a major issue? We're going to talk about it. So, if you are dealing with a wood door, you should be happy because wood cabinet doors, if they're done right, should be able to last a lifetime. However, there are certain issues that are pretty much unavoidable when you're dealing with a wood door. And that has a little bit to do with the construction. So a wood door is made of several different components. You have the panel in the middle, you have the rails that run side to side, and the stiles that run up and down. The way that these are put together is actually not mechanically at all. There's no nails, there's no screws. It's just using something called joinery, and that's shaping the wood so that different pieces fit together. In this case, it's a simple tongue and a groove, right? So you have the tongue on the rail, you have the groove on the stile. Actually, the groove runs around the inside of all the rails and stiles, and that's what the panel fits into. But the way the door is actually put together is you cut these tongues using a tool called a router. You cut these tongues onto the end of the rails, and then they fit into the grooves. Now, nothing special about a tongue and a groove. If you wanted to pull it apart, you could just pull it apart. The step that makes these doors pretty much indestructible is to fill this tongue and groove with wood glue, and you put it on clamps. When that wood glue dries, it's actually stronger than, if you look between the grain of wood here, right, these different layers of wood, those are different, distinct layers of wood that are held together with something called lignin. It's a natural material. It's like a natural glue that forms within the wood. Wood glue, when it dries and when it's applied properly, is actually stronger than the lignin that holds the grain of wood together. So literally you have a joint that's stronger than the wood itself, right? However, wood behaves differently than other synthetic materials. It absorbs moisture differently. It expands and contracts, right? So one problem that you might find on a wood door is where the rail and the stile meets over time, you might see these little gaps opening up, okay? Doesn't mean that the door was built incorrectly. It doesn't mean that they used a low quality wood. That simply means that the wood is expanding and contracting. It could be the result of excess moisture in the kitchen. It could be the result of a leak somewhere under the cabinets. It could be the result of poor construction, right? But these sort of hairline cracks where the rail meets the stile, it's an unavoidable consequence of using wood because wood expands across its grain more than it expands along its grain, right? So if you have two pieces of wood that are perpendicular to each other, this piece of wood is going to be expanding this way, this piece of wood is going to be expanding this way. So this piece of wood is going to be pushing on this shoulder every time it expands and contracts throughout its lifetime. And there's pretty much no way around it, right? It's just something that has to be managed, right? So if you have a painted wood cabinet door, one thing that you could do is, if you notice that the gaps are a little bit larger than you would like, you could take a little bit of wood glue, put them into this seam, force it in with like a popsicle stick or something like that, clamp it. When you take the clamps off, it's going to be as good as new, right? A little bit of cleanup, you're going to get rid of those seams. So something to look out for, but again, not something that's necessarily indicative of a major problem. Another issue that you might encounter that is very unsightly, definitely something that should be rectified by yourself if you're selling a house, or something that you should ask some questions about if you're looking to buy a house, is chipping of the paint, right? So again, if you notice chipping on the face of a cabinet door, that's indicative of damage, either water damage or somebody banging into it or whatever. If it's on the edges, then this is just pretty normal wear and tear, right? Because what you have here, different than a thermofoil, which is a solid sort of wrap that goes around a particle board door, is you have paint applied directly to wood. So if it's on the top of a drawer where you're sliding things into the drawer, taking things out of the drawer, the paint is going to scuff. The good news is it's actually a pretty straightforward repair. I'm going to show you how to do it if you think it's something you might want to try to do yourself. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take the cabinet door or the drawer face off. Cabinet door, it's pretty easy to pop the hinges off. Maybe you'll have to unscrew them. It'll be easy to reline it up. I wouldn't recommend trying to do this in place. You're going to be making a little bit of dust, and it's going to be a lot easier to work. You know, if you'd be working at like, waist level, like on a table. If it's a drawer face, it's going to be pretty easy to take off. There's an extra step. It's going to be screwed in, right? Usually this one had 6 screws. So there are the 2 screws that go and hold the handle on, and then there were 4 other screws that actually secure it to the front of the drawer. So you're going to want to pop those off, bring them somewhere where you could work comfortably, plenty of light, where it doesn't really matter if you're going to make a mess. So cabinet doors nowadays are pretty much going to be made out of 1 of 2 things. Either they're going to be made out of solid wood, or they're going to be made out of a particle board. Particle board has a bad rap. Obviously, it's a cheaper construction. More often than not, it's not going to be painted. It's going to have something called a thermofoil. It's like a wrap that they put on it. 9 times out of 10, you wouldn't be able to tell. If you're walking through a house, if you're looking at a particle board door or a solid wood door. There are going to be some telltale signs. So if you look at the top of the door, you're going to see something like this. This is a tongue and a groove. That means that you're dealing with a wood door. Something that you might notice that has gone bad about a particle board door is if you see large areas of paint looking like they're like lifting, or a lot of like chips and gouges out of a door. That could be an older particle board door with the thermofoil, where the thermofoil, the wrap, is actually starting to separate from the door. Also, particle board is not as resilient as wood. So if you're noticing a lot of like dents and dings and gouges, chances are you're dealing with a particle board or a wood door that somebody just beat the hell out of. So you've got the drawer or the door face off. You got it somewhere where you could make a little bit of dust and where you could work comfortably. First thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to sand the area, right? I know that you're going to want to try to, not disturb the paint and just put some paint on there and get it over with. I promise you, it's gonna have a superior result if you just take a little bit of time just to lightly sand where that chip meets the paint that's still intact. Now, the reason that you're doing this is, 1, you want to get rid of the ridge that's going to exist between the bare wood and the paint, right? Paint doesn't go on very thick, but it does create a little bit of a ridge when it gets chipped off. The other thing that you want to do is you want to remove any loose paint. Maybe paint that's still on the door or the drawer face but hasn't come off quite yet. You want to remove that because you want to put new paint on top of the old paint. Right, so you've got that sanded. Next thing you want to do is you want to get a quality primer. Here I'm using Kills 3. It's premium. It's a really good primer. It's going to give you really good adhesion. You don't want to skip the primer because the primer is what's going to give the paint something to stick to. So you want to put the primer on very, very lightly. You're going to still be able to see the wood through the primer. Don't try to load it up all in one coat. You want to look at the edges. Make sure that you hit any areas that might be chipped on the edges, and also be mindful of any drips or runs of paint. Now you see I'm just using a regular foam brush, so you might have little streaks in here. So long as you put the paint on thin enough, that will be something that you could sand out in between coats. Right, so once the primer dries, you can see you see the wood kind of coming through. Again, totally normal. Now we can start. Here I'm using Benjamin Moore. I got this paint color matched, not just the paint color, but also the sheen to the existing cabinet. Now that this is totally dry, we can come through with our paint. Same thing. You want to go very lightly, Better to build it up with thin coats than to try to get it all globbed on there in one coat and run the risk of, there being drips or something like that. Again, doing this very, very lightly, applying very little paint, and I'll build this up over subsequent coats. And that first coat of paint dried. Just going to hit this with the second coat, again very light. And I'm starting to notice some brush strokes. So when this is all dried, after this second coat, I am going to hit this with a really, really fine grit sandpaper just to try to smooth out those brush strokes. But again, paints nowadays, especially if you get a paint designed for like specifically, it's gonna have a tendency to sort of flatten out on its own, right? So you don't necessarily have to go crazy about brush strokes if you're seeing them. After it dries, it has the ability to kind of level itself out. So don't sweat that too much. So be patient. This is one of the doors after 4 coats of paint. I did light sandings as needed in between coats with a 400 grit sandpaper. Quick note about sandpaper: the higher the number, the smoother it is, right? So 400 to me is just kind of like the sweet spot. That's enough of a grit to take out the brush strokes, but it's not so much that you're actually going to be removing paint in between coats, so taking a step back for every step forward that you take. Going with something like a 600 or an 800 grit sandpaper, you're going to be sanding a lot, and you run the risk of sanding too much and taking paint off. So again, 400 to me is just a perfect. You could buy 400 grit sandpaper from any hardware store, Lowe's or Home Depot or whatever. Hit it as you need to get rid of the brush strokes so that you end up with this real nice smooth glass finish that matches the factory finish that was achieved with a sprayer that puts it on very, very thin. So if it's something that you're noticing on your kitchen cabinets, and you want to address it, again, it's a pretty straightforward repair. A little bit of sandpaper, a little bit of paint. Don't try to cut corners on the prep though. Do the sanding, do the priming, make sure you give adequate dry time, and sand it in between coats. It really makes a huge difference. It really will give you that smooth factory looking finish. And then your cabinets will look as good as new. So hope you enjoyed.